لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our series, Reflections on the Qur'an. We've been talking about methodology of tafsir of the Qur'an, and in a previous episode we talked about one of the major forms of tafsir, which is called tafsir bil ma'thur, tafsir based upon narration, and we talked about some of the major works of that type of tafsir. And today I'd like to discuss tafsir bil ra'i, tafsir based upon the discernment of the mufassir, the person who's undertaking the commentary, or a more fancy word, exegesis of the Qur'an. We mentioned previously that the Sahaba were reluctant to engage in this kind of tafsir, and that the early scholars of Islam, that they tended to be hadith scholars and they just collected narrations. But we also said that there were very few direct statements by the Prophet ﷺ explaining the meaning of a particular verse, and that even when you expand the range of hadiths that have some relation to one verse or another, there are still many verses that would not necessarily have a hadith that applies to them in particular. And therefore, what we came to know as tafsir bil ma'thur, a lot of it was statements attributed to the Sahaba, and even more so to the tabi'een. So to call that the opinions of the tabi'een tafsir bil ma'thur, that's part of what people understand to be tafsir bil ma'thur. But ultimately, the statement of a tabi'i is also his opinion regarding the meaning of the verse. So from that angle, opinion also is present in what is called tafsir bil ma'thur. Scholars, in looking at is it permissible to use personal discernment, personal opinion on the part of a scholar to explain some facet of the meaning of a verse, one of the items of evidence, or the type of evidence that they called upon to support this procedure, were certain Quranic verses that call upon the believers to contemplate the Qur'an, or that mention that the very reason for its revelation was that they contemplate it. In Surah Muhammad, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Will they not meditate on the Qur'an, or are there locks on the hearts? So locks on the heart is a negative description, and it implies that those kind of hearts are not meditating on the Qur'an, which means that it's blameworthy not to meditate upon the Qur'an. In another passage, Allah says in Surah Sad, كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ إِلَيْكَ مُبَارَكٌ لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ وَلِيَتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. This is a scripture that we have revealed to you, full of blessing, that they may ponder its verses, and that men of understanding may reflect. So that's a very concentrated, from different angles, an encouragement to reflect upon the Qur'an and to ponder its meanings. One item of evidence that's used in support of tafsir bil ra'i, to me it's a rather obscure angle of reasoning. The dua of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, Allahumma faqihhu fi d-din wa 'allimhu at-ta'wil. O Allah, grant him understanding of the deen and teach him the interpretation of the Qur'an. The angle of reasoning by which this hadith was invoked, they say if ta'wil, which is another word that's sometimes used instead of tafsir, if it was limited to that which is transmitted, then there would be no point in singling it out for mention. I find that a rather unconvincing use of that statement of the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, counter-arguments could be made against it. However, when we mentioned earlier that the Sahaba were reluctant to engage in tafsir bil-ra'i, to give a personal opinion about a verse that's not based on some explicit narration from a higher authority, particularly the Prophet ﷺ, we do see examples of it. And the classic example is the narration. It's an authentic narration. I can't, off the top of my head, recall whether it's both in Bukhari and Muslim or one or the other, that Umar radiallahu anh was sitting with some of the elder Sahaba. And Abdullah bin Abbas, who was much younger, Umar was inviting him to sit with his buddies, so to speak. And some of them, they came to Umar and said, "Why are you letting this young guy sit with us?" They didn't seem to really appreciate that Ibn Abbas was sitting with them. And so the next time they got together, Umar, he said, "What do you say?" He asked all that were sitting there, "What do you say? Give me your understanding of إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ تَوَّابًا." Surah Al-Nasr. So he asked those elder Sahaba, "What do you understand from this?" And they said, "Well, Allah is informing the Prophet ﷺ that when he sees many people entering into Islam, that he should do these acts, that he should make a lot of tasbih and seek the forgiveness of Allah." So they were just basically rewording what the surah was saying. And so Umar turned to Ibn Abbas. He let all these other elders speak, and then he turned to Ibn Abbas and he said, "What do you understand from this surah?" And Ibn Abbas said, it was Allah informing the Prophet ﷺ that when you see these signs, that you will die soon after that, and that you should prepare for that meeting with your Lord. And Omar, he said, "I see it exactly the same way that you do." And so what he was pointing out to those elder Sahaba was that this youngster, he has deep understanding of the religion, and he has just as much right to sit in this company as you do. And what is also to be gained from this incident is that the explicit wording of the verse doesn't contain the meaning that Ibn Abbas understood from it. And yet, Omar, who is obviously one of the most learned of the Sahaba about the Qur'an, and he is also a genius when it came to fiqh. He was a faqih. So these two leading fuqaha from the Sahaba, that they understood it to be permissible to extract meanings from the Qur'an that were not explicitly present in the wording, and that they had not heard from the Prophet ﷺ. To me, that's a very powerful evidence for the permissibility of the use of personal discernment in extracting meaning from the Qur'an. Now, one of the major scholars of the sciences of the Qur'an, he's talking about the parameters by which this kind of tafsir that's based or that includes an element of opinion, there are parameters that need to be followed in order to prevent abuse of the unregulated use of opinion. And this is what we were talking about earlier with regard to the proper methodology. He said, start with al-manqul al-sahih, what has been authentically reported from the Prophet ﷺ, and also refer to the tafsir of the companions. Their opinion should be given consideration. Undertake linguistic analysis with proper consideration for the rules of the language. Take into account the context of the verse in the larger passage, including the purpose for mentioning it. So an opinion that doesn't fit with the larger context of a particular verse, that's an indication that there's something wrong with that interpretation. And number 5, that the objectives of the Sharia should be brought to bear in evaluating some opinion. Is this consistent with the objectives of the Sharia? So if something passes those tests, then it is admissible to use opinion after that. And 3 types of knowledge have been identified in the Qur'an, and we'll talk about that classification after the break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
The value of money in the hereafter will be measured by its proper use in the present.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا أنفقوا مما رزقناكم من قبل أن يأتي يوم لا بيع فيه ولا خلة ولا شفاعة.
According to the glorious Qur'an, one of the best ways to use your money is to spend it in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by spreading His message of Islam. Peace TV is a non-profit Islamic satellite television channel that is primarily dedicated for just that cause, the proper presentation of Islam. It's a great choice to invest in it and a golden opportunity to purify your wealth in a way that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Support Peace TV. Send your zakat and donations to IRFI Al Ryan Bank, 47 Calthorpe Road, Birmingham, UK. B151TH. Pound account number 011-32301. IBAN GB49ARAY 30008301 132301. Sort code 300083. Swift BIC code ARAY GB22. Please confirm your contribution at support@peacetv.tv.
Support Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
Every action depends upon its intention.
Intention sincere.
What is your intention? Why do you do what you do?
Concentration, focus, dedication, dynamic.
Every single aspect of your mind, of your soul, of your heart, is it for Allah, sincerely for Him? Or is it for something else?
Get going on how to improve your prayers.
The purpose of these talks is to counter exactly that type of behavior.
Join Abdul Rahim Green.
In other words, with the outward action, there is also an inner dimension.
In Inner Dimensions of Worship, every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and repeat telecast at 8:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV. The value of money in the hereafter will be measured by its proper use in the present.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا أنفقوا مما رزقناكم من قبل أن يأتي يوم لا بيع فيه ولا خلة ولا شفاعة.
According to the glorious Quran, one of the best ways to use your money is to spend it in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by spreading His message of Islam. Peace TV is a non-profit Islamic satellite television channel that is primarily dedicated for just that cause, the proper presentation of Islam. It's a great choice to invest in it and a golden opportunity to purify your wealth in a way that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Support Peace TV. Send your zakat and donations to IRFI Al Ryan Bank, 47 Calthorpe Road, Birmingham, UK. B151TH. Pound account number 011-32301. IBAN GB49ARAY 30008301 132301. Sort code 300083. Swift BIC code ARAY GB22. Please confirm your contribution at support@peacetv.tv.
Support Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
Welcome back. We're talking about tafsir bil-ra'i, tafsir that includes some of the ijtihad, the personal effort, and the reasoning of the commentator, the mufassir, of a work of tafsir. And we mentioned some of the parameters that would be necessary to be observed in order for this exercise of personal opinion to be regulated and not just become a license for people imposing their opinions upon the Qur'an and saying about the Qur'an that which the Qur'an has nothing to do with. And we started talking about types of knowledge in the Qur'an. Allah mentioned that there's some references in the Qur'an, the mutashabihat, that the true meaning of those references are known only to Allah. And so for people to speculate about what they mean, nobody can say what they mean. And there are other aspects of knowledge in the Qur'an that relate to the unseen, and this aspect of the unseen is something that Allah informed the Prophet ﷺ about. And so this second type of knowledge, the only way that it can be acquired is through the Prophet ﷺ. So there has to be reference to authentic hadiths when any kind of discussion takes place about those matters. And then there are other matters, which is knowledge which is open to human investigation, and that this last type is the lawful subject for tafsir bil-ra'i, tafsir that includes the use of opinion. In the remaining time, let's just take a brief look at some of the major works of tafsir bil-ra'i. One of the most famous is Al-Kashaf of Zamakhshari. Zamakhshari was a non-Arab born to a Persian-speaking family in the area that was in ancient times called Khwarizm, and that area, part of it now, the southern part is part of Iran, and the northern part, I think, is in Turkmenistan. And Az-Zamakhshari became an expert in the Arabic language. He wrote books on the meaning of unusual words that appear in the Qur'an and the Sunnah. He wrote a book on balagha, the principles of rhetoric. But he's most well known for his tafsir of the Qur'an, which he composed on a visit to Mecca. He visited Mecca twice. The second visit, he was 60 years old, and his reputation preceded him. He was welcomed by the governor of Mecca, and he was asked to give tafsir in these public gatherings. So the content of his lectures, somebody wrote it down. That turned into Al-Kashaf. And he was a Mu'tazilite, very kind of dogmatic adherent of this rationalist school, which by his era, which was like the 5th century, that school of thought had long since passed its pinnacle of prestige and power in the Muslim lands. At one time it was the official ideology of the Abbasid state, but eventually the rulers who came afterwards changed their opinion and they distanced themselves from this school of thought and its opinions. And because when those people had the ear of the Sultan, the Khalifa, they abused their power in order to try to force everybody to toe their line when it came to issues of belief. Because they tried to impose their opinion on everybody else by force, and people who weren't willing to accept their position on the issue of whether the Qur'an was created, when they lost official patronage, there was this rebound where they became generally despised. Despite that, the school lingered on for some centuries after that, and Az-Zamakhshari was an adherent of that school. So you can see, he was right up front about what his point of view was, because in the very first line of his preface to the work is, Alhamdulillah, alladhi khalaqa al-Qur'an. All praises for Allah who created the Qur'an. Some people said, look, if you want people to read your book, take that part out. So, although his tafsir has many reflections of his dogmatic position, it's not primarily a dogmatic tafsir. It's primarily a linguistic tafsir. So despite his views on issues of aqidah, where the majority of scholars disagree with him, his tafsir has continued to be a reference for scholars down through the ages. Some scholars came along, they relied on his tafsir and then took out all the stuff that they found objectionable and sort of provided a cleaned up version of it. Baydawi is a famous example of a scholar who did that. But scholars still continue to refer to Zamakhshari because he had a lot of insight in, he would point out, well, why is this particular ayah phrased in this way? The normal way that you would expect it to be phrased would be something else, and then he would point out the reason why it was phrased in this different way in order to make some special point. And that kind of discernment, he reached and surpassed what other scholars had written about from that angle regarding the Qur'an. And so despite the fact that there's many objectionable elements in his tafsir, it's still a tafsir that people refer to. Another mufassir, I find his tafsir to be really interesting, and there are nuggets and gems embedded in this tafsir, is Fakhruddin al-Razi. He died in the 606 after the Hijrah, so he was basically working during the 6th century. And he was born in Rai, which is now modern Tehran, and he was really poor as a young man, but he studied knowledge. He studied with a teacher whose teacher was Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, who happened to also be the teacher of al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali never taught al-Razi, but al-Razi studied with somebody who studied with Ghazali's sheikh. And so you see the influence of these major scholars as time passed in the Muslim Ummah, that their legacy of learning passed down to succeeding generations, and other scholars benefited from their learning and then made their own contributions. And Razi ended up settling in Herat, where he was given a royal welcome, literally, by the ruler of that state. And in fact, the ruler invited al-Razi to actually come to the palace, and he opened a portion of his palace so that al-Razi could give lessons to the public. And it's said about him that, when he would get up and he'd walk from one place to another, that all these students they'd get up and they'd be walking with him, asking him questions as they're walking, because they just wanted to benefit from his knowledge. So, in our day, you don't see that kind of behavior being displayed towards scholars of Islam very much. You see it with rock stars and movie stars and stuff like that. We live in a different time. So al-Razi was a pretty die-hard Ash'ari, so he used his tafsir in part to try to refute the position of the Mu'tazili school. So he would mention Zamakhshari's views on various points and then refute them. And he also spent a lot of time trying to refute philosophers, the people that were attributed to Islam or associated with Islam, but their thought was based upon Aristotle and people like that. And he went deep into philosophy. It's mentioned about him near the end of his life that he said, I spent all this time studying philosophy, and it did nothing to increase my yaqeen, my certainty upon the truth of this message of Islam. And in fact, I found that at the end of the day, it was kind of a waste of time. And he said, here at the end of my life, I am returning to the aqidah of my grandmother. So, women in that era didn't frequently have the same opportunities as men did to study Islamic knowledge. So frequently they were just on fitra. They didn't know that much about Islam, but they believed in it in a very kind of simple level. Now, his tafsir is noted for, it's very lengthy, although its official name is Mafatih al-Ghaib, it's frequently referred to as Tafsir al-Kabir, the big tafsir. And one of the reasons that it's so big is that he likes to go off on tangents. He'll discuss an issue, he'll break it into sub-issues, and then the sub-issues sometimes will break into sub-issues, and the discussion can become so long that you lost track of where he started. He likes to discuss philosophical issues. He likes to discuss issues of usul fiqh that have some kind of connection to a verse. He also brought in discussions of the natural sciences of his time. And because of that, Ibn Taymiyyah, he dismissed al-Razi's tafsir as everything but tafsir. Ibn Subki, he responded to this criticism and gave a more balanced assessment of al-Razi and his work. He said it's everything and tafsir. And for sure, it's full of tafsir, but some of his tangents, one can skip over that and not lose much. Now, let's just give a little taste of what he had to say about something that gives you an indication of what tafsir bil-ra'i can offer. At the beginning of Surah Al-An'am, it says, Alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal-ard. So he talks about the meaning of alhamd, and he says it refers to praise. But now there are other words that are related to it in the Arabic language, and he goes into a discussion of how hamd is different from these other words. So madh also means praise, but it can mean praise of a person, or it can mean praise of a thing, something which doesn't have a mind. So you can praise madh of a pearl, make praise madh of a pearl. You can't make hamd of a pearl because a pearl can't think. So it would be inappropriate to say al-madhu lillah, because Allah is highlighting here that He is rational. And another aspect of difference is in terms of the word shukr. Shukr is an expression of gratitude, a feeling of gratitude or an expression of gratitude to somebody because they've done something to benefit you. So to say ash-shukru lillah would narrow down the meaning in a way that's inappropriate, because when the person is saying alhamdulillah, it expands the meaning that Allah is being praised for all that He does, whether it personally benefits the speaker or not. And then he goes into an objection that people might make to, well, you know, other people can be praised for things they do. And Al-Razi makes the point that whatever anybody does in order to benefit somebody else, it's by something that Allah has given them. So ultimately the praise is for Allah. And there are a lot of more fine points associated with that issue, but we've run out of time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahu a'lam.
اقرأ أخيا